The brass bell above Harper's Treasures chimed softly as Daniel Carter pushed through the weathered door, his worn combat boots creaking against the old wooden floor. The pawn shop sat tucked between Charleston's historic buildings, like a forgotten memory, its hand-carved sign so faded you had to squint to read the letters. Dan stood just inside the threshold, his faded army jacket hanging loose on his thin frame. 3 months since his discharge, 2 months since he'd lost his job at the warehouse, and now he was down to his last $20. The eviction notice crumpled in his back pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Behind the glass counter, an elderly woman looked up from polishing an antique brooch. Evelyn Harper, 78, had owned this shop for 40 years, and her sharp eyes had seen every kind of desperation walk through that door. But something about this young soldier made her pause. His shoulders carried more than just the weight of worn fabric. They carried the burden of a man who'd run out of options. "Good afternoon," she said gently, setting down her cloth. "What brings you in today?" Dan's hand instinctively moved to his inner jacket pocket, fingers touching the small wrapped object he'd carried there for weeks. His grandfather's Purple Heart, the only thing of value he had left. William Carter had earned it in Normandy, bled for it in Belgium, and passed it down with stories of brotherhood and sacrifice that had inspired Dan to enlist. "I need to sell something," Dan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Evelyn nodded, her expression unchanged. She'd learned long ago not to judge the desperate, only to listen. "Take your time, no pressure." "Here." The shop felt heavy with history. Pocket watches that had counted someone's final hours, wedding rings from marriages that didn't survive, photographs of faces that would never smile again. Dan wondered if his grandfather's medal would join this collection of abandoned memories, another piece of someone's soul gathering dust on a stranger's shelf. He pulled out the small bundle, wrapped in his grandfather's old handkerchief, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it on the counter. The Purple Heart gleamed dully in the afternoon light filtering through the dusty windows, its purple and white ribbon still vibrant despite its age. Evelyn's breath caught almost imperceptibly as she saw the medal. Her fingers, steady despite her age, reached out to touch the edge of the fabric. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, her voice carrying a weight Dan couldn't quite understand. Dan swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. "I don't have any other choice." He gestured at the medal with a shaking hand. "My grandfather, William Carter. He was a sergeant in World War II. This is all I have left of him, and His voice cracked. "I need the money!" Evelyn lifted the Purple Heart carefully, turning it over in her weathered palms. The engraving on the back caught the light. "WCC, William Charles Carter." Her fingers traced the letters as if they held some secret meaning. "Tell me about him," she said softly, not looking up from the medal. Dan's jaw tightened. He hadn't come here to share stories. He'd come to make a transaction. "Mom, with respect, I just need to know what it's worth. I've got rent due tomorrow, and my landlord isn't the understanding type." But Evelyn seemed lost in thought, holding the medal like it was made of glass instead of metal. "Your grandfather, did he ever talk about the war? About France?" "Not much," Dan admitted, frustration creeping into his voice. "Look, I know it's not worth a fortune, but it's got to be something, right? It's a Purple Heart. It's real silver. It's from the 1940s. Evelyn finally looked up, and Dan was surprised to see tears gathering in her pale blue eyes. "You don't understand, son. This isn't just any Purple Heart." Dan felt a flutter of hope. Maybe it was worth more than he thought. Maybe he wouldn't have to sleep in his car tonight after all. What do you mean?
I mean, Evelyn said, her voice trembling, I knew your grandfather. The words hit Dan like a physical blow. He stared at the old woman, searching her face for signs of confusion or lies. That's impossible. He died when I was 12. He never mentioned anyone named Harper. Evelyn's smile was sad and distant. He wouldn't have. Your grandfather was the kind of man who did good without expecting recognition. Dan's hands clenched into fists on the counter.
This was just his luck. Some senile old woman spinning fairy tales when he needed cold, hard cash. Ma'am, I think you're confused. My grandfather lived in Virginia his whole life after the war. He never came to Charleston. No, Evelyn said,
quietly. But I came from France. The words hung in the air between them like smoke.
Dan felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, his desperation warring with confusion and a growing sense that something much larger than a simple transaction was unfolding. France? Dan repeated, his voice hoarse. You're from France? Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the Purple Heart. A small village called Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, not far from Utah Beach. I was 14 when the Americans came. She paused, her fingers still tracing the medal's surface. Your grandfather saved my life. Dan's world tilted. He'd heard fragments of his grandfather's war stories over the years, mentions of Normandy, of villages liberated, of friends lost. But the old man had always been vague about details, always said the war was something better left buried. I don't believe you, Dan said, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something in Evelyn's eyes, a certainty that made his skepticism crumble. You don't have to believe me, Evelyn replied gently. But I need you to see something. She moved toward a small safe behind the counter, her movements deliberate despite her age. I've been waiting 78 years to return something to the Carter family. Dan watched, transfixed, as she opened the safe and withdrew a yellowed envelope. His grandfather's name was written across the front in faded blue ink. Sergeant William C. Carter, 101st Airborne. He left this behind, Evelyn explained, holding the envelope like it was made of precious metal. In all the chaos of the liberation, he forgot it in our barn. By the time we found it, his unit had moved on. Dan's hands shook as he reached for the envelope. Inside was a letter, unfinished, in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. Dear Martha, if you're reading this, then I made it through another day. The French people here remind me of home. Good folks caught in bad circumstances. Today I helped a family with 2 young children. The letter ended mid-sentence, as if William had been interrupted by duty or danger. Dan's throat closed, completely. He'd never seen his grandfather's handwriting from the war, never imagined him as a young man writing love letters to the grandmother Dan had never met. This doesn't change anything, Dan said desperately, though his voice was barely a whisper. I still need the money. I'm sorry about your family. I'm glad my grandfather helped, but I can't eat sentiment. Evelyn's expression grew stern. Put that metal away, son. What? I said. Put it away. You're not selling it to me. Dan's desperation flared into anger. You
can't do this. You can't get my hopes up with some story and then refuse to buy it. I need this money. No, Evelyn said firmly. You need to understand what you're carrying.
Dan's composure finally shattered. Understand what? That my grandfather was a hero? I already knew that. It doesn't pay my rent. His voice rose, echoing off the shop's cluttered walls. You think I want to sell this? You think this is easy? For me? Tears he'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. I enlisted because of him, because of the stories he told, the man he was. I served 8 years, did 3 tours, came home to nothing. No job, no family, no future.
And now I'm supposed to what? Sleep in my car because some old woman wants to lecture me about understanding. Evelyn watched him break down without flinching, her expression compassionate but unwavering. Sit down, Daniel. How do you know my name? Because your grandfather talked about you. In his letter, there's more. She pulled out a second page Dan hadn't seen. He wrote about his grandson, the little boy who loved to fish and fix things. Someday I'll teach Danny everything. I know about being a man, he wrote.
He's got good hands and a better heart. Dan collapsed into the chair beside the counter, his head in his hands. Then why did he leave me this burden? Why didn't he leave me something useful, something that could actually help? Because, Evelyn said softly, he left you something more valuable than money. He left you proof that one person can make a difference. She walked around the counter and sat beside him, her movements careful but determined. When your grandfather found my family, we were hiding in a barn cellar. German soldiers had been through our village taking food, terrorizing families. My little brother was sick, my mother was injured, and I was just a scared girl who thought we were all going to die. Dan looked up, his eyes red and swollen. Your grandfather didn't just chase away the soldiers, Evelyn continued. He stayed with us for 3 days. He shared his rations. He helped treat my mother's wounds. He told stories to keep my brother from crying. And when he left, he gave me something that saved our lives. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. His good luck charm said it had kept him alive through Normandy, and now it was our turn to be safe. Dan stared at the locket, recognizing it from old family photos. His grandfather had worn it in every picture until the day he died. I made a promise that day, Evelyn said, that if I ever had the chance to repay William Carter's kindness, I would. And now his grandson is here, and I can finally keep my word. Dan's resolve crumbled completely. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about legacy, about the ripple effects of one man's compassion across decades and continents. I don't know what to do, he whispered. Yes, you do, Evelyn said gently. You know exactly what your grandfather would want you to do. Dan wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. His grandfather's unfinished letter still clutched in his trembling hand. For the first time in months, he felt something other than desperation. He felt the stirring
of purpose.
He'd want me to find another way, Dan said quietly. He'd want me to keep the medal and figure out how to survive without selling my soul. Evelyn smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. Now you're thinking like a Carter. She stood and walked to an old filing cabinet in the corner, pulling out a folder thick with papers. I've been in this neighborhood for 40 years, Daniel. I know every business owner, every landlord, every person who might need a good worker. Dan watched as she spread the papers across the counter. Job listings, business contact information, rental properties. Mrs. Harper, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I've been looking for work for 3 months. Nobody wants to hire an ex-soldier with gaps in his employment. Nobody you've talked to, Evelyn corrected, but you haven't talked to the right people. She pulled out a business card and handed it to him. Marcus Thompson owns a construction company 2 blocks from here. He's also a Vietnam veteran who's been looking for someone with military experience to help manage his crews. Dan looked at the card skeptically. And he's going to hire me just because you recommend me? He's going to hire you because I'm going to tell him the truth that you're William Carter's grandson and that means you come from good stock. Evelyn's eyes sparkled with determination. Marcus served with the 101st Airborne, same as your grandfather. Different war, same brotherhood. She handed him another card. And this is Elena Rodriguez. She owns 3 apartment buildings in the downtown area. Her father was a refugee from Spain, and she understands what it means to need a fresh start. Dan felt a flicker of hope, but years of disappointment had taught him caution. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Evelyn picked up the purple heart again, holding it up to catch the afternoon light. Because 78 years ago, your grandfather looked at a scared French girl and her family and decided to help, even though he didn't know us. He didn't ask for our credentials or our references. He just saw people who needed help, and he helped. She pressed the medal back into Dan's hands. Your grandfather planted seeds of kindness that have been growing for decades. Now it's harvest time. Dan closed his fingers around the medal, feeling its weight differently now. Not as a burden to be sold, but as a reminder of who he was meant to be. What if they say no? What if this doesn't work? Then we try something else, Evelyn said simply. But we don't give up, and we don't sell our heritage to survive. We find a way that honors the people who came before us. She picked up her old rotary phone and began dialing. Marcus, it's Evelyn Harper. I have someone I want you to meet. The conversation with Marcus Thompson lasted 20 minutes. Dan sat in stunned silence as Evelyn spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades building relationships and earning trust. He served 8 years, 3 deployments, she was saying. Leadership experience, mechanical, skills, and more integrity than most people see in a lifetime. She paused, listening. Yes, he's available immediately. Tomorrow morning? Perfect. She hung up and smiled at Dan's shocked expression. Marcus wants to meet you at 7 a.m. sharp. He's got a big project starting next week and needs someone who can handle both the technical side and the people management. Just like that? Dan asked, disbelief thick in his voice. Just like that, Evelyn confirmed. She dialed another number. Eleanor, it's Evelyn. I have a young man who needs a place to live. The second conversation was shorter but equally successful. Elena Rodriguez had a small apartment available above her downtown market, and she was willing to waive the deposit for someone Evelyn vouched for. Dan felt lightheaded. In the span of an hour, his entire world had shifted. I don't understand how this is happening. Evelyn sat back down beside him, her expression gentle but serious. This is how communities work, Daniel. Real communities, not the anonymous cities where everyone's a stranger. Your grandfather understood that. He knew that helping others creates connections that last generations. She pulled out a small notebook and wrote down addresses and phone numbers. Marcus's office is on Meeting Street. Elena's apartment is above Rodriguez Market on King Street. Both want to meet you tomorrow. Dan stared at the paper, his mind racing. What if I mess this up? What if I disappoint them? What if you succeed? Evelyn countered. What if you become the man your grandfather knew you could be? She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Charleston street where tourists and locals mingled in the fading afternoon light. I've spent 78 years waiting for this moment, Daniel. Waiting to repay a debt I owed to a man who probably never thought about it again after he left France. Dan joined her at the window, the purple heart warm in his palm. He thought about it. He used to have nightmares sometimes, especially toward the end. He'd wake up calling out names in French. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Marie and Jean, my mother and brother. He remembered us. He remembered everything, Dan said softly. He just never talked about it, because he said the war belonged to the people who didn't come home. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the world go by outside. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "There's one more thing I need to tell you, about why I never married, never had children of my own." Dan looked at her, sensing another revelation coming. "I made a vow that day your grandfather left," she said, "that I would live my life in a way that honored his sacrifice. I would help others the way he helped us. This shop." She gestured around the cluttered space. "It's not just a business. It's a place where people bring their desperation, and sometimes, if I'm lucky, I can give them hope instead of just money." Dan understood now why she'd refused to buy the medal. This wasn't about commerce, it was about completing a circle of kindness that had been 78 years in the making. The next morning, Dan stood outside Thompson Construction at 6:55 a.m., his grandfather's Purple Heart pinned inside his jacket pocket right over his heart. He'd slept better than he had in months, not because his problems were solved, but because, for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond mere survival. Marcus Thompson was exactly what Dan had expected, a weathered man in his 70s with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much. He looked Dan over with the practiced gaze of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. "Evelyn says you're Bill Carter's grandson," Marcus said without preamble. "Yes, sir." "She tell you I knew your grandfather?" Dan nodded, surprised. "She mentioned you served with the 101st, Marcus's expression softened. "Different war, same unit. Your grandfather was a legend by the time I got to Vietnam. They still told stories about him, how he'd stay behind to help civilians, how he never left a man behind." He paused. "You look like him." "I hope I can be half the man he was." "That's up to you," Marcus said. "I've got a crew of 12 guys, working on a historic renovation downtown. It's delicate work, requires someone who can follow instructions but also think on their feet, someone who can lead without being a tyrant. Evelyn thinks you're that someone." Dan met his gaze steadily.
"I won't let you down, sir." "I know you won't," Marcus replied.
"Because if you do, I'll have to answer to Evelyn Harper, and that woman's scarier than any drill sergeant I ever met." They shook hands, and Dan felt the strength in Marcus's grip. Not just physical, but the strength of a man who'd built something, lasting with his own 2 hands. "Start Monday," Marcus said. 7 a.m. sharp. Pays fair, benefits are decent, and if you prove yourself, there's room to grow. After the meeting, Dan walked to Rodriguez Market feeling like he was floating. Elena. Rodriguez was waiting for him with a warm smile and a key to apartment 2B. "Any friend of Evelyn's family here?" she said, leading him up the narrow stairs. "My father came to this country with nothing but the clothes on his back. I know what it means to need a fresh start." The apartment was small but clean, with a window overlooking the market below. It smelled like bread and coffee and hope. "First month's rent is on the house," Elena said. "After that, we work out a payment plan that fits your new job." She handed him the key. "Welcome home, Daniel." That evening, Dan returned to Harper's Treasures to find Evelyn waiting for him with a bottle of champagne that looked older than both of them combined. "I've been saving this for a special occasion," she said, producing 2 mismatched glasses. "Seems like today qualifies." They sat in the shop's quiet comfort, sipping champagne and sharing stories. Dan told her about Marcus and Elena, about the job and the apartment. Evelyn told him more about his grandfather, about the 3 days that had changed her life forever. "He used to say something," Evelyn remembered. "The medal's not for the man who earned it. It's for the people who remember why he earned it." pulled out the purple heart, looking at it with new eyes.
I almost threw away everything he stood for. But you didn't, Evelyn said firmly. When it mattered most, you made the right choice. That's what courage is, not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite the fear. She
raised her glass to William Carter, who taught us both that kindness is never wasted. To William Carter, Dan echoed, and to Evelyn Harper, who kept his legacy alive. 6 months later, Dan Carter stood in Harper's Treasures again, but this time he wasn't desperate. He was wearing clean clothes, his hair was freshly cut, and his eyes held the calm confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. "Is making me a supervisor," he told Evelyn, unable to hide his pride. "He says I've got a gift for bringing out the best in people." Evelyn smiled from behind the counter, where she was carefully cleaning a vintage watch. "Your grandfather would be proud." "I know he would," Dan said, "because I finally understand what he was trying to teach me." He pulled out a small wooden box and placed it on the counter. Inside, nestled in velvet, was his grandfather's purple heart, along with a new addition, a photograph of Dan with Marcus's construction crew, all of them smiling after completing their first major project together. "I'm not hiding it anymore," Dan explained. "But I'm also not selling it. Elena's letting me display it in the apartment. She says it's part of the building's history now." Evelyn nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what it should be. A reminder of what's possible when good people decide to help each other." Dan reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "There's something else. Marcus has a contract for a big renovation project in France. He wants me to lead the team." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "The project is in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont." Evelyn's hands stilled on the watch. "Your grandfather's village." "Your village," Dan corrected gently. "I want you to—"
"Come with me. I want you to show me where it all began." Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes. "Daniel, I'm too old for such a journey." "No, you're not," Dan said firmly. "You're exactly the right age to go home and show them what became of the little girl my grandfather
saved." She set down the watch and looked at him for a long moment. "You know what this means, don't you? Going back there?" "It means the circle gets completed," Dan said. "It means we honor the past by building something good in the present." Evelyn walked around the counter and embraced him, this young man who'd become the grandson she'd never had. "Your grandfather always said that heroes don't stay heroes by accident. They stay heroes by choosing to be heroes every single day." Held her gently, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose in equal measure. "Then I guess we'd better keep choosing." 3 months later, Daniel Carter and Evelyn Harper stood in a small French cemetery, laying flowers on graves that had waited nearly 80 years for visitors. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont had changed, but the memory of liberation remained strong. Local children gathered around as Evelyn told the story of the American sergeant who'd saved her family, and Dan showed them his grandfather's purple heart. "He taught me that medals aren't for the people who earn them," Dan told the children in his halting French. "They're for the people who remember why they were earned." That night, in a small hotel overlooking the beaches of Normandy, Dan called Marcus Thompson to report on the renovation project's progress. "The work's going well," he said. "But more importantly, I think I finally understand what my grandfather was trying to tell me all those years." "What's that?" Marcus asked. Dan looked out the window at the French countryside, where American soldiers had once fought and died for strangers they'd never meet. That the best way to honor the past is to build a future worth having. When he hung up, Evelyn was sitting by the window, her fingers tracing the outline of his grandfather's locket. the same one she'd carried for 78 years. "No more debts," she said softly. "No more promises to keep. Just new ones to
make," Dan replied, sitting beside her. Outside, the Norman moon cast silver light over the fields where William Carter had once walked, never knowing that his simple act of kindness would ripple across decades and continents,
touching lives he'd never imagined and creating connections that would outlast them all. The Purple Heart rested on the nightstand between them, no longer a burden or a commodity, but what it had always been meant to be, a reminder that courage, once planted, grows in directions its sower never expected, and that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in battles won, but in lives changed for the better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.